Princip and a crew of fellow Serbian nationalists. Exactly 1 month later, Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia, and thus began the First World War. Today, some people are pointing out geopolitical similarities between 1914 and 2014. Similar dynamics of rising powers, falling powers, new technologies, and dangerous tinderboxes. I wanted to explore that. Joining me to do so are former CIA Deputy Director John McLaughlin, who had a new piece on Aussie.com titled How 2014 is Strikingly Similar to 1914. Historian Jeffrey Wavro, author of A Mad Catastrophe, The Outbreak of World War I and the Collapse of the Habsburg Empire. And Walter Russell Mead, Professor of Foreign Affairs at Bard College. John, why don't you start us off, since your piece started us off in a sense. What do you see as the principal similarities between 1914 and today?
Well, there are two or three. We had a tinderbox in 1914. It was called the Balkans. Today we have a tinderbox in the Middle East, a situation which could easily spin out of control in exactly the way that the Balkans took things out of control in Europe in 1914. We also have a geopolitical rivalry that looks similar in some respects. Today it's between China and the United States. Back then, of course, it was between Britain and its empire, which was on the verge of decline, and a rising Germany. Also, I think today we are lulled by the prospect that globalization will somehow save us from catastrophe because we are so interdependent globally. Back then, they had the same illusion. They thought that things like the steam engine, the telephone, the telegraph, air power, and such, that would save them because they were becoming increasingly interdependent.
Walter, when you listen to these similarities, where do you come out?
Biggest similarity is that the same problem that helped drive World War I in the Balkans, the bad fit between state boundaries and then nationalism, these popular forces of identity, culture, language, we see that all over the Middle East today, and that's driving a lot of conflict in the Middle East. The Sunni-Shia divide, but also the Kurdish question, Israelis, Palestinians, nationalities whose identities are weak. Syria and Iraq are both kind of multi-communal states, and they're not holding up well, and we see these forces ripping them apart in the same way they were ripping apart the great empires at the start of World War I.
And yet there's a kind of indifference, I think, on the part of the great powers regarding the Middle East that didn't apply in the Balkans. The Balkans was a hotly contested area in 1914 because the Austro-Hungarians saw their future spreading down through Macedonia to Salonika, but the Russians, on the other hand, saw their future getting control of the Turkish Straits, getting control of the Balkan Peninsula, to control the Eastern Mediterranean. And I think we have a real sense of Middle Eastern fatigue among the great powers today, who look at this and they have interest there: energy, security, client states, ports on the Mediterranean in the case of the Russians in Syria, and yet they're not willing to go all in the sense that they did in 1914. I think that's a key difference.
I'd like to push back on that a little bit, because I think there's a similarity there too, in the sense that in 1914 there were certain things that great powers couldn't tolerate. Britain couldn't tolerate Germany on the Channel. Germany could not tolerate Russia mobilizing. Well, today, I don't think in the end the United States can tolerate a terrorist state occupying territory in the Middle East, which is where this situation is going. I don't think Iran can tolerate, in the end, a Shiite power next to it that is defeated, and I doubt that the Saudis can tolerate, in the end, a Shia crescent which stretches across that part of it.
So this is a very important point, because I was struck, as Jeffrey was, that the big difference strikes me is then the great powers were really eager to get involved and jockeying for advantage. Right now, the great powers are almost trying to stay out, but you say they will get sucked in the end.
I'm saying that I think the prospects are good that they get sucked in some way. It won't look exactly like 1914 because it is 100 years later. The weaponry is different. The ways of influencing people are different. We have social media. We have cyber. We have all of the things that can bring potentially surprises, just as machine guns and air power and such brought surprises in 1914.
Remember, the other powers were dead set against the Balkan inception of the war. The only ones that were eager to have a Balkan inception were the Russians and the Austrians.
Meaning
the French, the British, the Germans all didn't want the war to begin in the Balkans. They didn't see anything in the Balkans as being worth a war. they got in basically to maintain their alliances. So I think this is where the parallel is somewhat forbidding, because, you know, it could be a case where we feel we need to back somebody to show credibility, to demonstrate credibility, demonstrate strength, and not to lose influence over that client or not to lose influence over adversaries. That's sort of how Britain and France and Germany got involved in this war in the Balkans.
And Walter, would that apply to Iraq? That we would get in because we want to show the Iraqi government we support?
Well, it would be less the Iraqi government than the Saudis, in a sense, because, you know, the sense that the Sunni-Shia war is really a proxy war between Iran and the Saudis. The biggest difference, though, that I actually see is in 1914, you had Germany, a rising power, and then all around it, every other power in Europe was in decline. You look at Asia today, Japan doesn't really feel that it's declining. Vietnam is a rising power. There are a lot of rising powers in Asia. That's a different kind of dynamic. It's explosive, potentially, but it's different.
Asia is certainly the area that's most redolent of these 1914 tensions, because you do have a rising China that reminds one of Germany, challenging the might of Great Britain, the sea power, and also just its imperial reach. And this is an area, given the U.S. Pivot there, putting troops into Australia, making alliances with Vietnam, with the Philippines, trying to encircle China. Remember,